Well, it's really good to be with Sheikh Dr Muhammad Al-Hussaini. Muhammad is a friend for, I don't know, three or 4 years now, and it's so good to have you here, Muhammad. So thank you for coming.
Mate. It's an honour to come and talk to you.
Yeah, so our kind of Guardians of the Flame crew have kind of had a work trip over to Luton for the day, and we interviewed Peter Adams earlier in the day, and now we're actually this is my mum's house, and in just outside Luton, between Luton and Harpenden, and Muhammad, you kind of live in London, and I guess I'm gonna go kind of. Sometimes when you do these interviews, you do it in a more narrative style, tell the story of I think I'm going to go kind of start it, probably the episode in your life that maybe brought you to prominence, certainly in Ireland in terms of the news and stuff. And that was essentially the pastor of the largest Christian church in Belfast, Pastor Jim McConnell, made statements about the Islamic religion that would be offensive, I think, to any Muslim, really. And he was taken to court, and in his defense, you spoke. And obviously, as an Islamic scholar, as a man of profound faith, that people are like, who's this speaking up for this kind of fundamentalist preacher? Can you kind of take us through some of those events of what happened and what you saw happening, and what was it that prompted you to kind of speak?
Well, I think the context for it was, along with Jewish rabbinical colleagues and some Muslim colleagues and a lot of Christian colleagues, as junior clergy across the three different faiths, and also Hindu colleagues, actually, we have been struggling in this country with a really polarized position. Between, on the one hand, people on what you might call the political far right, who have used abuses of religion as a vehicle to stoke the flames of ethnic as well as religious prejudice and hostility towards different people groups. But then, on the other hand, you have a lobby that kind of has managed quite successfully to jump on the bandwagon of our millennial belief that we have a right not to be offended, and use that as a way to apply downward pressure on the academic freedom to discuss, to debate, and quite rightly to criticize, to critique matters of religion, religious teaching, doctrine, as well as the practice of different people. And so, I personally, and indeed many of my colleagues, have experienced this when we have tried to have frank conversations about teachings within our own traditions that we struggle with. As a Christian, you will, as a devout, believing Christian, you will doubtless have struggled with difficult passages in your scriptures, and I have in mine. And yet, when we talk about the doctrinal mandates for example, misogyny or violence, or the fact that all three of our traditions, Judaic, Christian, and Islamic, seem to condone at some level practices that we would find abhorrent today, like slavery. This kind of discourse has been heavily limited by the current environment in which we're not able to discuss things freely and openly. So in that context, Pastor James raised a couple of issues to do with Islamic teaching. I think he did so by his own admission as somebody who wasn't from that tradition. He talks about being a simple preacher, and he talked about the beliefs of the Islamic faith in the context of the persecution of Christian minorities around the world, which is something I deeply care about. It's something I saw during my seminarian days training in Egypt. I saw the way that the Copts were being treated, something I have a very heavy heart for. And so when he did so, he used language which I would disagree with, and I've told him, and we've discussed that. But what I was extremely concerned about was the role of the judiciary in interpolating itself into areas that I would have considered and my colleagues would consider to be matters for civil society. So the space within which we operate is a space of ordinary citizens engaging and discussing and disagreeing about religious beliefs, political beliefs, a range of different issues. And for this to be criminalized, for the judiciary to insert itself into that space, and subsequently, as inevitably tends to happen in the north of Ireland, it became politicized and became a green-orange issue at a certain level later down the line, with the nationalist position being in favour of prosecuting Pastor James McConnell and then his unionist colleagues, because his congregation has quite a number of Christian believers from the unionist tradition, defending him. It was just not this kind of situation that predisposed to an honest conversation. So I actually did nothing, really, nothing new, nothing special, nothing spectacular. And I want to really emphasize that. Actually, all I did was follow in the footsteps of a really wonderful and gentle and gracious man, Father Paddy McCafferty, who's a Catholic priest, who is a survivor of Catholic clerical abuse, among other things, and a very vocal critic of some of the wrongdoing within the church's hierarchy, but at the same time a very devout and doctrinally conservative Christian believer. And in a situation that arose between them, where Pastor James had some hard words to say about the teachings of the Catholic Church and talked about the idea that Mary, the Blessed Virgin, might eventually become in Catholic teaching the fourth person of the Trinity, and when he was, doing Christian witness in Catholic parts of Belfast, Father Paddy McCafferty, he didn't squeal to the teacher, he didn't call in the authorities. He did what every Christian rightly should do, which is to go and to meet and to talk. And out of that, there were very robust disagreements. They had a good Barney. But over tea and cake, over 20 years, there developed a very strong bond between those two men. And so all I did was follow conscience and follow what I know of the Irish people and of tea and cake. And engage in a just a simple, genuine way. I was concerned for Pastor James. He's the same age as my dad, near enough. And I know from personal experience, when my dad sat in front of the TV and he sees things that conflict with his worldview and the life that he had growing up, the social conservative attitudes he has about family, society, sexuality, and all the rest of it. He expresses the views with all candor and all conscience. And so I saw reflected in Pastor James many of the honest values that I see in my own parents, and I'm committed to defending that. But at the same time, I'm very conscious of the hurt that was caused to the very small Muslim community in north of Ireland, Northern Ireland. And I was very concerned that this might lead to a polarization that might actually result in violence, or there was already some violence, but to an explosion of violence. And so in that environment, the way to talk peace is to go in with an honest heart, to say, look, I'm nobody. I'm very small, I'm nobody, and I just want to have an honest conversation about these things.
Yeah. So you kind of talked about Father Paddy McCafferty, who's from a Catholic background, a long-term friendship he had developed with Pastor James McConnell. And Pastor McConnell's an interesting guy. So a couple of years ago, a few of us in Rostrevor, led by Tommy Sands and also by yourself, developed a kind of what is becoming a charity, Art to Wonder, taking a line out of one of Tommy Sands' songs from The Music of Healing, the song The Music of Healing. And Art to Wonder, it kind of convened essentially a gathering of religious leaders from the Muslim, Protestant and Catholic backgrounds and Jewish rabbis, Muslim, Christian and Jewish leaders. But of course, in our context in Northern Ireland, Christian also has that Protestant Catholic divide, which is more significant than in many places. And one of the first things we did was invite Pastor McConnell came down, members of the Islamic Institute in Belfast who had kind of essentially been the ones who had been very disturbed by his comments. And, one of the things that they had said was, when a pastor like yourself with thousands of people in your church preaches a sermon against Islam, more of our members get beaten up that week. And it kind of feels like you're, as I've observed your kind of life and your involvement in that particular situation, you find yourself often kind of between, a rock and a hard place. It kind of seems to be a theme in your life.
Tough, yeah.
You're the not necessarily devil's advocate in a kind of a contrary way, but you have the ability to kind of see the other side, where most people would have been deeply offended at Pastor McConnell's words. You saw in him someone that reminded you of your dad. But I'm sure you also very much see the hurt of an immigrant population.
Absolutely.
Your own parents were immigrants. Can just before we kind of go into issues and theology in your own life, what is it that you think has shaped you to be that kind of in between person that often finds yourself befriending the others and kind of seeing it from the other perspective?
Well, I guess it's the kind of realities of being somewhat rootless when you're a second generation son of immigrants, but brought up by my parents outside the community, outside the migrant community. My mum and dad were very determined that I shouldn't end up being ghettoized, and neither myself or sister. And so I had the honor and privilege, nothing that I've ever done, but my parents put me into schooling where, 40% of the lads at my secondary school were Jewish, and it was I've been in at least nominally Church of England foundations from throughout my educational history. So in that environment, you just have the experience of growing up and living together. And I think Pope John Paul talks about the most earnest and real dialogue is the experience of living together. When he went to visit Christian communities in the Levant and across the Middle East. So the reality for me, and indeed for my mates growing up together, was that of being friends and brothers, where the religious labels mattered less than the realities of our relationship with God. And that is a point at which all conservative, traditional believers across the different faiths can agree. So I can talk to Pastor James and I can talk to Father Paddy McCafferty, and they totally get it when we talk about God speaking to the heart of every single individual, regardless of their confession or belief. God does not have favorites. God will talk to the most ardent atheist opponent of any theistic doctrine, and likewise all three of us in this peculiar trinity recognized the problems of institutional and organized religion, and that is another manifestation of conservative religious belief. They realize that the institutions aren't important, and the institutions are in many cases part of the problem. And so, it's part of the prophetic calling that Pastor James speaks to, that Father Paddy speaks to, that yourselves all speak to, is that you're not about the kind of communitarian institution defending religious believer, but rather you speak out of Scripture, you speak out of the traditions of people of faith who have bravely spoken what they conscientiously believe to be true. And so when you come to a conversation with somebody recognizing and validating the fact that, you recognize that they are speaking conscientiously and not out of any sort of disingenuous political malice or anything, then that's a point at which honesty, honesty becomes the foundation for that conversation. I would, but at the same time, in relation to Pastor James's comments, I have, we've had conversations about 1 Peter 3:15, always with gentleness and respect, and what constitutes a Christ-like way of bearing witness and bringing people to Christ, and these are honest conversations that we're able to have, but at the same time, there's genuine love. I've been to Whitewell Metropolitan Church a few times now, sometimes on my own, sometimes with others, and it's just a wonderfully warm, welcoming environment.
Not a lot of people called Muhammad.
Not a lot of people called Muhammad, and some people, some of my colleagues, rabbinical colleagues and others, and liberal Christian colleagues have taken offense when I said, well, actually, they have prayed for me from the pulpit and said that, he's on a journey, and let's hope that, that journey brings him to Calvary. And I'm honored that they say that. Others are offended that they say that about me, but it shows a genuine commitment to living a Christian life, and it enables people of sincerity to speak to one another. And I think that's very much what Ankuan has been about. Is very much what Rostrevor has been about, and what Tommy and Katrine and the brothers and sisters there have been committed to. There are far too many dialogical initiatives that are actually not about dialogue at all. They're about they're not interfaith dialogue, they're intercommunal politics, and they're politicians doing political maneuvering and not saying what, I've always talked about the worst kind of interfaith as these meetings of nice people saying nice things that they don't really mean to each other. So it's quite the opposite.
And going back to that first encounter that we had in our center in Rostrevor and Ankuan, we had a circle of people, and we had Pastor Jim McConnell on one side with a couple of his elders. We had former Presbyterian moderator, former Archbishop of Armagh from the Church of Ireland, Catholic bishops, Benedictine monks, a couple of rabbis, one from Belfast and one from London. And we had several people from Sunni and Shia backgrounds from the Muslim tradition. And I found it very meaningful to sit there and to listen to, and it was uncomfortable to face what he said. Pastor Jim, you said this, and for a member of the Islamic Institute to kind of say, this is what it made us feel like. And for him to respond, and, I think that was a meaningful process. In that kind of first day together, one of the things that we decided, how do we have a conversation with all these different religious leaders? And I suppose one of the thoughts was you were one of the ones really kind of saying, look, we don't want to just have a nice kind of quote unquote interfaith gathering where all these different religious leaders come and like you said, they all say nice things to each other. How do we have something of a discussion that's a bit more robust and also, but also a bit constructive? A phrase that you used was a higher quality of disagreement or a better quality of disagreement. What does that phrase mean to you?
Yeah. Well, it means on two levels. It means what, in an experiential sense, it means the kind of conversations that you and I would have had growing up as kids with your mates, your Jewish mates, your Christian mates. They just say what's on their mind. But you're still friends, and the affection and the brotherhood holds that conversation together. So honesty held within relationship is the natural reality of our family and friendships growing up on a personal level. But in the public domain, in public conversations, it's very much the reverse. So people are in conversation, but they're not in relationship when they're having those conversations. And consequently, they constantly have half an eye towards their own constituency, half an eye towards where they want to get in their careers and in their political self-advancement. And in the mix of all of that, the whole exercise becomes disingenuous. Change can only happen when there is trust. Trust will take time to build up, but certainly a very large part of building that trust is to say from the outset that I'm not going to participate in the art of saying nice things you don't really mean to people you don't really like, but go in with an absolute commitment to being true to who you are, and where necessary to saying things from a place of conviction that you genuinely believe, as opposed to saying things purely in order to hurt other people. And so with that in mind, when, one of the sort of the upshots of the Rostrevor initiative was I got invited to speak to the Newry Interchurch Forum. And again, that was an environment where, in contrast to the niceness of North London culture, this kind of John Knox, North of Ireland, preaching tradition meant that people just said what they felt, and they said how frightened they would be if they saw a woman in a burqa walking through the middle of Newry, and how shocked they would be if they saw mosques being built in their neighbourhood. And I took that, and I felt it. It hurt.
Yeah.
But I felt it as a genuine expression of how people had perceived the realities of what they saw on their TV screens and the risks that it potentially posed to their communities, their lives, their families, and so on. And I can acknowledge that people will need to accommodate change. They will need to accommodate diverse, the diversification of Northern Ireland and of Ireland, both ethnically, linguistically, in all kinds of ways. But at the same time, if there is not the exercise of listening to people's concerns and fears, then we will get ourselves into a terrible mess, as we've seen. So.
Yeah. One of the what we decided when we first met together in that group was we were kind of thinking, how do we kind of bring it together? What can we kind of talk about, essentially? We want to have a discussion with Muslims, Christians, and Jews, but what do we talk about? And a suggestion, I think it was Father Mark from the Benedictine monastery up the road, said, ask everyone where they see hospitality in their own tradition, in their own faith, in their own scriptures.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really what we kind of studied that first day, is what does hospitality mean? And we kind of then went off in our religious groups to discuss what does it mean for Christians where do we see hospitality in the Bible? And the Muslims did the same thing, and the rabbis did the same thing. What, if you think of Islam, what do you think of when you think of hospitality? Obviously, we're talking about immigrant populations, the way we speak to each other, the way we deal with difference. What does hospitality in your scriptures mean to you?
Oh, absolutely. Well, it's a huge question, and deeply embedded within both scripture and tradition, the oral tradition of my faith of heritage. You talked first of all about the role of scripture in these kind of conversations, and one of the things that is extremely helpful in promoting that higher quality of disagreement is the discipline of grounding our conversations about what our own traditions say in the texts that speak to that. So it can be a very problematic conversation when I'm sat there saying Islam says, and somebody on the other side of the table is saying, well, Christianity says. Well, I don't have the authority to speak for Islam, and the Muslim sat on that side and that side of me will have completely different views to what I might have to say. And consequently, one of the disciplines in building a higher quality of disagreement is to ground the conversation in the text. It both provides a referee in terms of, what does Islam actually say? What do the hadith say? What does the Quran say? As opposed to what does, any particular individual have to say about the faith. And at the same time, it also provides an atmosphere in which, because of the presence of the sacred, it kind of regulates people's behavior. And so it enables people to disagree quite sharply with proof text, and for text to be the basis upon which conversation about religious difference to be grounded. In relation to hospitality, that is one example where there is abundant material in both the scripture and in the hadith, which are the oral sayings of Islam's prophet that have been transmitted to us by his companions, and then the followers of those companions, and then later on compiled into bodies of oral tradition. So there is considerable material that talks about hospitality across religious tribal boundaries. So the story of the feast at which at which Islam's prophet said, "Don't forget our Jewish neighbor. Don't forget our Jewish neighbor," and to make sure that the Jewish neighbor was fed and catered for as well. There's hospitality that predates Islam, the coming of Islam to the Arabian Peninsula, which is grounded in a desert society where hospitality isn't just kind of a nicety, a social courtesy. It's a matter of life and death. So if somebody touches the tent peg of your tent, then you are honor bound to take them into your protection. So if you don't have people to look out for you in time of famine or when you're being threatened by your enemies, you're a dead man. So hospitality is an essential part of the fabric of society. So somebody who comes to you seeking protection has the right to your protection. It's not just an option. It has the right to your protection. Somebody who comes to you seeking your care, you're being fed and looked after. Any person can come to your house. To this day, any person can knock on your door if you're a Muslim and stay at your house for 3 days, no questions asked. It's just one of those things. You have a duty to provide, and that is grounded in scripture and in the oral tradition. And there are scriptures that there are stories that we share in common in our scripture. So, for example, the story of the visitation of the angels to Abraham at the terebinths of Mamre. That story is found in the Quran as well. And so the discussion around that in the Islamic tradition, provides a very rich basis for conversation with our Jewish and Christian brothers and sisters. So hospitality is grounded in a sense of the duty of protection to one another in a survival environment, but it's also grounded in the sense that hospitality knows no name, no tribe, no differences of confession, and it's a level at which we are nakedly human in front of one another.
Okay. I think what it would be interesting just to hear your thoughts. We've talked a lot about speech and free speech and how to disagree in a way that's actually where we really are disagreeing robustly, respectfully, hopefully, but not also, just beating around the bush and kind of not really saying anything. And you've also talked about the importance of, really looking at our scripture when you're coming from different religious backgrounds. I guess when I look at the world today, we do have a scenario where we have this clash of what you described at the beginning as kind of millennial, maybe this kind of politically correct kind of culture of using the right language. And I've heard people say, well, that's just kind. That's just being kind. It is, to say politically correct can mean at its best just being kind. But I think we all probably also have seen examples of it being maybe going a bit far, and you can't even really speak any, it feels like for many people. On the other hand, you've got, the phenomenon of certain political leaders that may or may not go named who are have been becoming extremely blunt in an unprecedented way in the political sphere. And you've got cases of religious leaders from all religious traditions kind of using speech that is far from respectful.
Quite.
How do you think in this society that we're living in 2020, can we balance the need to be respectful, to be kind, but also to be able to disagree well and kind of move beyond just kind of the inability to really actually communicate well? And,
sure.
What are some of how do we do that? Not even partly, I guess, as religious people, but then also out in society where people may or may not have religious faith. Sure.
Well, I mean, to speak of religious people, I mean, I think the starting point has to be an acknowledgement that in certainly in the Abrahamic traditions, there is a recognition of the presence of God in every single individual, regardless of their confession. And if that is taken away from the conversation, and Christianity, for example, becomes what it became in Germany between 1933 and 1945, where Jesus was removed from his Judaic context, from his Jewish context, and instead was transformed into an Aryan anti-Semitic superhero, and where religion became about blood and soil and honor and all that kind of stuff. Then we are no longer in the space. We're no longer in a Christian space. And I have seen both in the Middle East, in the Muslim context, and also, sadly, also in North America at times, in a Christian context, where sometimes in some of these large-scale religious gatherings, it's very difficult to know where, for example, the cross ends and the Star-Spangled Banner begins. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, where in, we don't even have to go to the Middle East, in parts of London, where God is barely talked about, and it's really about the length of your beard, and that you dress like us, and you look like us, and you and you are part of the tribe. And then it turns into the idolatry of tribalism. And, I don't need to talk about that in the Northern Ireland context. There's that famous story, the anecdote, I've forgotten the name of the politician who said, when challenged by a very brave Church of Ireland minister who went to talk to his Catholic neighbours at a time when you didn't do that sort of thing. And the politician said to him, let's keep the religion out of Protestantism, And so when we've lost the fundamental Christianness of our Christianity, or the Islamness, the submission to Godness, which is what Islam means, of our Muslim heritage, then it becomes an idolatry of tribe. And it, as Jonathan Sacks talked about, the uniqueness of monotheism being the abandonment of my God, my petty godling, my tribe versus your tribe being grounded and built into doctrine as my God versus your God, of Moloch versus Ammon and all that kind of thing. When the starting point for our conversations is an abhorrence of that idolatry, of that tribalism, and of recognizing that we are all children of the one Father, then you can have differences that it can be quite robust. Because, as I've said, just like when we were young, you can have robust differences, but they need to be held in relationship. You cannot have robust differences where the relationship is broken down. And those groupings who are out to separate people into tribes, those kind of people are not the people that you can countenance in conversation. Whereas people of robust belief who might utterly disagree with the doctrines and traditions that I hold, but nonetheless, from their belief perspective, recognize me as a child of God, just like every other. Those are kind of people that you can have very clear differences of belief.
And you touch on there really the idea of religious nationalism.
Yes.
And I read an article yesterday that was kind of implying actually many people who call themselves religious in places like the North American context or over here, they may call themselves that, but it's really just a kind of a moniker. It's just a kind of way of saying basically I'm British or I'm American,
Quite so.
And actually their behavior doesn't usually exhibit much in the kind of faithful witness of a good life,
Mm-hmm.
But those who are more inclined to be faithful, weekly adherents of their faith in some way, it does tend to kind of impact on their, the way they hold their beliefs. I've heard it said it's not so much what we believe, but how we believe it, and certainly I think faithfulness in a religious context can lead us to hold our beliefs in a better way.
Yes,
would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's both about the conviction that we hold to in being seekers of truth, of prioritizing truth, and not allowing our pride or our prejudice to get in the way of that pursuit of truth, and recognizing that our views can be challenged, and if we are truly disciples of God and of truth, then we should be open to changing those beliefs. I mean, my positions on many things have been challenged and broken down, and I've had to rethink them, and that ought to be the sincere position of any person of faith who truly recognizes that only God is truth. And religious nationalism or positivus Christentum in the Nazi context is something that we see spread far and wide across the Muslim world at the moment. The Muslim world is deeply idolatrous, and I say that very, very, very vocally. It is a profoundly idolatrous community or communities. You cannot go to a mosque of a different, slightly different sectarian belief. And even in this country, there are mosques that are separated on ethnic lines. The realities of Muslim society are about tribalism, conformism. It's partly shaped by a rejection by the colonial history and the rejection of Westernism. But here we find a situation where God has been subordinated to the human need to belong to a people group and to a tribal construct, and that's idolatry, and that's what my tradition, my religion, my scripture speaks about very vocally. It's something that Jesus's life and ministry exemplifies. He sat with Samaritans He spoke to tax collectors and prostitutes. He broke all the rules of tribalism. And it's something that the Jewish tradition, likewise, you talk about the tikkun olam, of healing the world, and not just the Jewish people, but of healing the brokenness of all of the universe in that sense. So yeah, I mean, a conservative conviction is a much easier basis for a conversation for me than people whose beliefs might be lukewarm, and those beliefs therefore transfer onto just kind of the institutional, things to do with organizations and vestments and committees and loyalty to institution, and that's been very profoundly problematic for me.
I'll ask one more religious question, and then maybe we'll talk about music.
Okay.
Just, you mentioned the word truth, and of course truth is, I mean, in some ways that is the ultimate polarizing word, like I have truth, in a postmodern context. What was it? The Manic Street Preachers 20 years ago had the album "This Is My Truth, Tell Me Yours," this, which is really uncovering that kind of a relativistic idea. It's hard to know what truth is. One thing that's been meaningful for me is seeing truth. Jesus said, as a Christian, I can say, Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." So he wasn't necessarily just saying these are a bunch of 50 propositional truths, believe them. He was saying, "I am the truth." Truth was embodied somehow in a person. And so truth became relational. Truth became, much more than just he was having an argument and he thought he knew right.
Right.
Do you kind of identify with that? Is there something in that kind of truth, not just being, of course we've got to argue about things, but is there a way that maybe we can hold our beliefs in a more relational way, and that almost becomes part of what truth is?
Absolutely. Well, I think one of the things that it's not as pronounced as in the Christian traditions, but one of the things that's certainly there is the reality of God being as close to you as your jugular vein, and also that the tradition that the heart of a believer is between the two fingers of his Lord. And he might wake up in the morning being a believer and go to bed being an unbeliever, or wake up as an unbeliever and go to bed being a believer. So the sense in which we have no right to claim as created beings, we have no right to claim the divinity, an attribute of divinity, which is possession of absolute truth. That's something that's very deeply grounded in our tradition, and rather there's other oral traditions that talk about how Islam will be divided into so many sects, and the majority will be in the hellfire. There's a Hadith Qudsi, which is one of the highest, most revered oral traditions, which kind of is approaching the status of scripture itself, and it talks about how the first three people in hellfire, the first will be an imam who has been a great religious leader and has preached, and he will say, have I not, Lord, have I not, done so many gracious things and know so much about religion and, preached so well in your name, and he will be cast into the hellfire because he did it for his own sake. And the second one is the to go to hellfire is the philanthropist who built who built religious structures and donated to charitable causes and did so much good in the world, but he did it not for the sake of his Lord, but to a certain extent it was contaminated by his own ego. And the third, which is particularly poignant in the current global situation of religious extremism, is the mujahid, the jihad fighter, the fighter for of religious, of holy war, who gave his life, who shed his life shed his blood as a martyr, and he will be cast into damnation for the same reason. So all the pious And I remember talking in, outside the courtroom with Pastor James about this, and how on the day of judgment in my tradition there will be so many shocks, and he says absolutely that's how it will be for me as well. So there is a profound recognition among those who have strong convictions that it would be idolatrous to say that I have the truth, because only God is truth. And through that, combined with the sense that that God's compass, he's not a God of the gaps. God's compass includes everyone, and all of us are children of God. And that doesn't mean all of us are right with God, but it means all of us are children of God. Through that, it provides the basis for humility, but also a relational engagement around questions of truth. I believe. But,
Okay, I want to take us to a different place, which is Irish music, particularly Irish traditional music. And what is unique about you is not only your capacity to dialogue with rabbis and fundamentalist preachers, but also that you are a sean-nós singer, which is a very traditional type of Irish music, and you've won awards. You're loved in Ireland. You sing in Irish. Where did that all come from?
Well, I think it arises at a certain level from you have the family that you're born into and the family that you're gifted into, and when you're traveling the road of life, there are different things that you're exposed to. You have your education, you have public school and Oxbridge and English culture and all that kind of thing. I've been playing the violin, not the fiddle, the violin, since I was 6 years old. Did all my grades and played in orchestras at school, and the music was nice. But one of the things that really changed things for me was I went to medical school, but I never wanted to be a medic ever. It was the family business. And so also I didn't have a very happy time engaging with us in the stuffiness and the elitism of the university that I went to. So out on the East End of Oxford, there was an Irish pub, the Bullingdon Arms. It's gone now, but it was there, and shouldn't be going into pubs, but there was a music night there, and so I just started to engage with that. I had Irish friends growing up, always loved the music tradition, but I thought it was so ethnically grounded that you kind of didn't even have the right to like Irish music if you weren't Irish. But in the Bully Arms, you were just welcomed for whatever little tunes you could pick up and play. And so it was primarily as a fiddle player, and then much later in life, when you've had difficult times and been bullied by religious leaders or whatever it is that's going on, you kind of hark back to the things that were good in your life, and so I picked up the fiddle again, and this time, went to the London Irish Centre, and there was this wonderful, just overwhelming welcome, for somebody who doesn't have a drop of Celtic blood in him, just overwhelming welcome. I met this brilliant. International award-winning fiddle player Karen Ryan, and so I've been doing the sort of advanced fiddle with her for a few years now, and it was actually her uncle, who it was a All-Ireland champion in sean-nós, who took me under his wing in relation to the singing, because I never really thought about the singing. I did used to sing in choir, chapel choir once or twice, a little bit. But the singing was never really a big thing. But then I just absolutely adored the Irish tradition of song, and Pat Connolly from Connemara. He's just been a mentor and a teacher, and just brilliant. And Seamus Brogan, again, sort of mighty champion singer from Wexford, from Cultus Culturier, and these friends and teachers and mentors, they have been nothing but the gracious soul of kindness to me. And so, in all of that rootlessness growing up, I finally found a home to which I have no connection by blood or genetics at all. but it's a family, and the Irish music tradition has just been a wonderful tradition, because it's like we've been talking about throughout. It's grounded in relationship. It's not sterile music up on the stage, and it's grounded in relationship. It's grounded in the pain and the suffering of history, of human relationship that can be broken, that can be rebuilt, and that's it's the relational dimension to it that's been more important than anything else.
Yeah. I mean, Irish music is, I suppose, best heard in a pub in front of a fire, where for a couple of hours you span the emotions from the heartbreaking kind of lament to, rousing, sing-alongs and. I mean, you've learned to sing in Irish. I mean, I won't get you to sing because your voice is gone a wee bit.
Gone, yeah.
But what would be? Could you recite a couple of lines of maybe a favorite Irish song? A song in Irish that you love.
Well, Sliabh Gael Goa is a song about home. And it was written actually in exile. In Wales, not so far away. It's a Waterford song, and it talks, about the longing for home, the sense of belonging, and it's always spoken to me. Partly because it was one of the first Irish airs that I learnt on the fiddle from Karen, and then later on, Pat Connolly, her uncle, put the words to it. So it was a sean-nós song that became a fiddle tune, and then it became a sean-nós song again, and it's just very very meaningful for me. And see if I can get my voice has been very broken. I'll see if I can just give it a go. Just a couple of lines of it. Oh, Sliabh Gael Goa fela is for the wheat again me he kosh gwynnym mener go trelach fwy fron until of we a heaved yonder megasure o clever ma Sliabh Gael Goa na fela na gere moskiol do menche mas moelter ich gen glas ne schever nor skapen jas nu grin on spergil gan small. No the menschen should when railton, nor a hidden drocht or around mar Sliabh Gael Goa nor yekshin do midir all. Oh, sorry, the voice isn't at its best.
Don't say sorry. That was beautiful, Muhammad. Thank you.
But yeah, it's songs that speak across the span of humanity. I mean, they are just common human traditions. They are. There's also research that alleges that sean-nós came from North Africa via Galicia to the shores of Ireland, and reflects the flow of migration and of human thought and art and wonderfulness across the seas. So another thing that was mentioned was there are traditions that are as far flung as Korea that have a Shan-Nos tradition that is rich and bright and beautiful and strikingly similar. So there are sort of assonances across continents that might be coincidental or might simply reflect the fact that we're all fundamentally human.
Well, maybe we'll just finish with a question about the word you said, home, there. You're someone, your parents left their home. They came to a new place. You live in south of England, but you've got this love for Ireland. You visit Ireland many times. What does home mean to you in that sense? Because you're like many people who are immigrant people. I mean, I'm a migrant person. My forebears left the north of Ireland to New Zealand. My dad moved back, 100 years later. I married an American. There's many more people migrating. We're living in increasingly pluralistic societies. What does it mean? What does home mean in the world that we live in now?
Sure. Well, I mean, there's a wider discourse. I mean, part of it came out of the recent sort of political ructions to do with Brexit and all the feelings that brought up in Britain. And there's been this discourse about a metropolitan elite that are everywheres. They are international, and in their outlook, they are socially mobile. Through technology, they can be everywhere at all times. And then on the other hand, there are the somewheres, people who are grounded in a sense of place, a sense of time, a sense of relationship. And when the everywheres and the somewheres come into opposition with one another, sometimes it can be difficult, and sometimes it can lead to very sharp political difference and division. And some of that was reflected during the Brexit debates, where communities that were somewhere communities voted very much against the sort of the everywhere perceived elite everywheres. And so I think for me, there's always been this very strong yearning to have a sense of somewhere, while recognizing the everywhere-ness of the heritage of the circumstances of my growing up. And I would have said that, I'm not somebody who's kind of an sort of socially mobile, everywhere kind of. I'm not very sociable generally anyway, but certainly when you come to places in the Gaeltacht in the west of Ireland, or in Donegal in north of Ireland, and Tommy's very kindly let me call Donegal home as well. So you find people who have a profound sense of their grounding in where they are and where they come from, but at the same time, very strikingly and quite extraordinarily have a sense of the sufferings and the feelings of others. So one of the in the context of the sense of place, and at the same time a concurrent sense of empathy that is global, despite being local. One of the most momentous events in my entire little life was a very good, wonderful singer friend of mine, Francie Devine, took me down to Cooley on the Cork Kerry border, and to a Sean O'Riordan mass that was led by his son Potter O'Riordan. And Potter is a giant in the Irish tradition, a protector of that heritage. And it was a Catholic mass, and I'm a Muslim imam. And he asked me, in the middle of this mass, it was all in Irish, the entire village spoke in Irish, and he asked me to recite, to sing, to cantillate some a couple of short surahs, short chapters from the Quran. Now, over here in England, when there is anything remotely resembling a Muslim imam being invited to say a few words in a Christian service, or something happens at a cathedral where there's a Muslim statement or some comment, it becomes kind of Daily Mail headline. And so I was very sensitive to that. And I said, oh my goodness, this is a Catholic Mass. The integrity of the Christian service needs to be respected, and so on. And then Potter turned to me and he said, well, there's been a lot of genocide in this part of Ireland, and a huge amount of loss and destruction of our tradition. And I got the sense that this was a man who totally understood who he was, where he was from, and he spent his whole life defending that. And then he said, because of that, we have a sense of the sufferings of others. And so I would like you to bring to this Mass something that is deep to your own tradition. And out of that deep and incredibly local sense of who they were as Irish-speaking people in that part of Ireland, they were able to empathise and to reach out with no sense of feeling threatened at all.
It wasn't
from another
It
culture.
wasn't diminishing their faith to
Absolutely.
allow your faith to be expressed,
or indeed my language and my culture. And so that kind of brings us back to the sense of those who have a strong sense of where they're from and what they're about and who they are and what they believe to be right and true. Those are the kind of people who, with integrity, it's about integrity, isn't it? Who those people, it's about people of integrity being able to engage with integrity with other people of integrity, and that really brought everything home to me, and it was a real kind of Damascus Road kind of in light. I remain humbled to this day by that.
Well, I think I can speak as a Christian that I think knowing you as I have for these years and working with you on a few projects, your faith has made my faith better. And I think that is the ultimate thing we want to strive for in life, is we're, rather than protecting ourselves from people that are different or feeling like we have all the truth and we need to give it, there does seem to be something beautiful about not moving into kind of relativistic truth, but appreciating the beauty and the faith of other people and the tradition. And you very much have I think have made me a better Christian,
Oh, bless you, mate. And likewise,
And you are, and I deeply respect your faith and the way you live your life and the way you've created space for people, the way Peter Adams this morning was talking about creating a space of grace. And I think when you deliberately, you just very obviously have friends across religious traditions. And so when we started meeting in Rostrevor, you were like, I'll call my rabbi friend, I'll call my Hindu friend. And it actually became very meaningful for us. Initially, I think community of Christians, we were like, but is that weird? Is this, how do we do this? We didn't really know what we were doing. We still don't probably, but I think it enriched us in some way. And so thanks, Muhammad, for your life,
bless you,
for your beautiful voice, your creativity, your commitment to Ireland, and commitment to peace and reconciliation. And commitment to dialogue and letting people speak and being courageous. So thank you. Thanks for having this interview.
Good market. Thank you, brother. Thank you so much.
Good.